I was thinking about axioms and grasping an axiom explicitly. I remember something about you can't form a concept unless you can contrast it with something else. Like if everything was a blue sky, an expansive blue
Right.
sky, you wouldn't be able to form the concept blue or sky,
Right.
right? I
You
think
have
that
no
was an Ito.
differentiation. Yeah. Or maybe Peacock may have said it. I think Peacock says in Hopar, actually.
Yeah,
But
maybe
yeah,
it's
you need
Opa.
something to say what's similar and also what's different. So that's why we talked about some things you need like three things possibly, like two blue things and a red thing to form the concept blue, or just two blue things and a not blue thing to form the concept blue, because you need a differentiation thing.
But if that's true, how does that apply to axioms? Because you can't differentiate existence from anything else. It's like a constant thing that's there. And same for sense of life. Like from what I read in the definition, she said, I can find it. And I had this as a question when I reread that essay. She said it's always present and underlies all your emotions. It's like a part of your very consciousness and the way you feel. And then you can't contrast it then because it's like there all the time. And
Well,
same for axioms as well. So those two problems are like, I'm not sure how that applies then if you can't contrast.
at least sense of life or any concept of consciousness, you'd have to be aware that other people are conscious. I think of that contrast. I mean, not that the experience itself in your brain, that your consciousness, the experience of consciousness needs to be compared to another experience of consciousness, as much as you know that there's the existent consciousness, that you know other consciousness, the other people are conscious, is what you're comparing it to in that case. I think that would also be the case for like um whatever you were just saying. I think existence, that concept existence, I think that's an exception. I think Rand even says that those are exceptions and they should be treated differently. They're not formed in the same way. So she does
Okay.
distinguish that much. But they do need to be formed from many concepts. You can't start there. So in some sense, at least you have more than one concept to deal with. You could at least integrate multiple concepts. And that might be where she might want to go with that. But they are different. I do know she says that. You can't treat them the same way as other concepts.
Okay. So what I got from you about axioms is that, well, you form the axiom of existence, even though existence is always present and you can't contrast it to anything else. You form it by identifying many different kinds of things that contrast with each other and finding the unifying element in them. And so that's
Yes.
different from an expanse of blue sky where there's no contrasting anything. And so you can't
Right.
even get the concept of like there are things.
Right. You don't even have, you can't even distinguish separate things with the expanse of blue, but existence is an abstraction. So in that sense, you have other things to compare with other than strictly the sensory things. And more the expanse thing, it's like that's more for sensory first level concepts. That if
Yeah.
you
Okay.
can't distinguish things at a perceptual level, then you can't form a concept at that level for that
Right.
particular kind of thing. Like if
Okay.
you couldn't distinguish colors, you couldn't have concepts of color or types of color, or even like blue, green, purple, or whatever. You would need at least some distinction, some perceptual distinction that you could make before you start forming concepts.
Got it. Okay. I follow that. And sense of life, I'm still not clear on. You mentioned in the way I form, I'm not sure if you were referring to sense of life or consciousness, because I don't think I worded the question well. I think when you said you contrast the fact that I have consciousness with someone else is that, people walk around and they also are conscious, something like that. And I didn't
Yeah.
quite get that. I found the original question I asked. So it's here and the wording is, okay, here was my question in relation to the sky. So if
Um,
it's something, like consciousness, okay, I can see animals have consciousness. I can see the I don't know if symptoms is the right word, but I can see the consequences of consciousness, and I can see the consequences of consciousness in other living things and in humans. So that's fine. But sense of life being implicit in everything, in all emotional responses and all of the experiences, how do you go, oh, here is my sense of life, if that's the case? Because then she's making a claim and I have no way to validate it because I don't know what my sense of, I can't see any, apparently it's there all the time, but I have nothing to contrast it to. So I don't know what it is.
Um, what are you comparing it with? Well, I'm not sure about a good answer to this. I can find the answer that Ren gives to this on a lecture. She kind of answers it. And a Peikoff lecture at the end, she answers something. Somebody asks a question. How do I identify my sense of life? I
I
think
know
that
that
would help.
I've seen that one, but I still, even with that
Yeah.
one, I didn't find it answered it because she said, I know it, I think I know which one you're talking about. It was a Q&A session. And
Yeah.
it was, she said, be at home with your emotions, know always what you feel and why you feel it. And then when you're at home with your emotions, then you'll start, and then you'll start being able to identify a sense of life. And then also consume a lot of art and be aware of your emotional responses to that art. But even with that, like, it still doesn't tell me if this thing is always there, it's always there in every moment of consciousness. Like there's no contrast to anything. That's what I don't get. Was I right about the Q&A? Is that the one you were talking about?
I'm not sure. I don't
Yeah,
think so,
okay.
actually.
Uh,
It's slightly different, I think. It may have been the same one, but I'm remembering different parts of it. Maybe it's the same thing, but remember different parts of the answer.
right.
Um, my thinking, I'm not sure why this isn't good enough, that you would start reasoning from grasping that there's various emotions you have. And by doing that, you could eventually get to the point where you can distinguish broader emotional feelings, broader sensations of emotion, or broader emotions. Like
Okay.
you could identify first about like anger, sadness. You can gradually gain more skill and see what's maybe in common among those feelings and create better abstractions about your emotions until you reach such a point that you could identify it on the widest level, the widest sense of your emotions, which would be something like I arrive at the concept of consciousness, probably, or being validating that you have the concept that you have consciousness is similar, probably. But I think you have to work it up from identifying first the various emotions, then eventually
It,
reach the point that you can distinguish it as a totality.
in a Q&A period in Ido, she says that she thought men would be a race of ideal giants if they were 1/10 as good as identifying their internal states as they are their external objective reality. And I
Yeah.
I don't know if they'd be giants, but I do agree with her that that's more difficult than
Yes.
observing external reality and conceptualizing it. Then yeah, so identifying your internal states accurately and
Yeah.
conceptualizing them is much more difficult. That's why I was thinking, as I was going through the history of philosophy, like all these crazy mistakes that are being made are often because they're making errors when they're introspecting, like they're suddenly saying concepts exist in another dimension, and because
Yeah.
or because it's so hard to introspect.
I think that's part of it. That if you can, you have trouble thinking about your internal states, how can you possibly write about the nature of concepts, the nature of abstractions? You
Right.
couldn't possibly be right. You'd be
Yeah.
wrong as like if your eyes weren't working and you were trying to make conclusions about how things look, even though you're blind, it would make no sense.
Right.
It's like thinking you can see when you're blind.
Hey, I
You
like that
can't do anything.
analogy.
Yeah.
It's a good analogy. Yeah, that's true. Even free will for me is still
Yeah.
like, I sort of get it, but you could give me the arguments. It would be like I'm the blind person who's given arguments to show why free will is any argument against free will is ends up in self-contradiction. It's irrelevant if I'm still not sure what exactly it is when I'm,
Right.
acting.
Right.
And yeah, but that's an example of that's still not clear to me, but that's an issue of introspection rather than observing external reality.
Yeah, I mean, you can comprehend the concept of it fine, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Not even the concept's tough, but right, you have to even get it on a direct level of introspective level.
Yep. Okay. I got questions about the Pythagorean. So essentially about Plato, because he picked up where they left. So this is what they believe about the world of numbers. It's only grasped by reason, it's immutable, and it's true reality. What does it mean when they say it's true reality? Does that just mean they give it a higher status? Is that it somehow in their mind they say this is more important than the other one? That's what they mean by true reality, because they're both realities, right, to them, or to Plato. We can go, yeah.
I think that's what people usually mean. That they usually mean that something is more real. That something is anything else is either just an apparent thing or just a layer in between. That the true reality is like behind the curtain. You can see through the curtain, maybe it might be blurry or unclear. You take away the curtain, then you find, and there's a true reality. Pull away the curtain.
It's still a bit strange because it's not. Okay, I'll go with that.
Yeah. So, like a thing with like Wizard of Oz, that like the true reality is the wizard controls everything. It's not that what appears to be the case. It's not that it appears that you run down the yellow brick road. It's that the wizard planned it all along, and that sort of thing.
Hey, I like that analogy too. I just read The Wizard of Oz as well. So, okay, I get it. That, yeah, it's like what he said earlier, where a lot of previous religions believed everything in this world happened as a result of a god in another dimension. So then if you do want to understand the world, there's no natural laws here. The laws are in the other dimension. So that's the more important. Okay, I go with that. I'll go with that.
Yeah.
I was trying to get my head around all these distinctions and which ones are important. So there's materialism, there's pluralism. Materialism, I understand materialism to be broader than pluralism, because you can have Thales' water, which is materialism, but monism, or you can have, and I think Anaxagoras said there's everything is different stuff. Like there's banana stuff, tomato stuff, cabbage stuff. So pluralism is broader. No, materialism is broader than pluralism, right?
I think they're just distinct. Materialism is just that everything is material. Nothing is abstract. Nothing is not physical. Everything is concrete objects. It's just literally material in the English sense of the word. As opposed to idealism, which is like the most extreme form would be like, there's only abstractions. The material world is just like an illusion, would be the opposite, like the other extreme.
Right.
That nothing is physical.
Monism is just
that. Yeah, idealism would be the opposite.
But isn't idealism includes a material world, right? So is there something that's no? Well, I don't think there's anything.
It depends. There's a range between the two. I think the most extreme idealist would say there's no physical world, which would be Berkeley. But then there's some that are less extreme than that, which like Kant would still say there's a material world, but he's an idealist in the sense that like there's something that, well, I don't know exactly, but there's some more greater truth placed on concepts and abstraction. That would be an idealist.
Okay. So the distinctions given earlier are just chronological as far as pre-Socrates, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle.
Yeah, it's just just chronological.
Right. And the important ones to keep in mind for me are trying to match different philosophers to these categories of
Yes.
materialist, skeptic, idealist. Where does
Yeah, they're
Aristotle
very
fit?
general. Aristotle's realist.
Oh, so there is another one. Okay, there's realists.
Yeah, that would be the best description. There's other ones, but
Okay.
some realism to some extent. But realism, yeah, which is a term people would use. It's not just
Okay.
an objectivist thing.
Cool. So a realist isn't okay. All right. I'll save that until I get to the
Yeah. And
leftist.
monism is just that everything reduces to one thing, or
Yeah.
everything is ultimately one. Pluralism is that there's not necessarily one thing, but there's more than one thing.
Parmenides was a monist.
Yes.
Cool. I get it. I asked you this question last week, so let's see what this one at the top I already asked, so I'll cross it out. Do you know much about, so Plato's form of the good, it's not a god, it's just some abstract universe of goodness, has no plan, no awareness, and everything strives for it. What does that mean? Everything strives for it. The ultimate form of the good.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Right. Okay, so he talks about transcending the intellect to have a mystical intuition to grasp the form of the good. And he says, this is mysticism, the view that knowledge is obtainable by means other than reason or the senses. Is he, I don't know if he's superimposing, is this an objectivist definition, mysticism, or is this used in philosophy as well?
More objectivist.
Yeah, okay, cool. And he said there's a determinist. Yeah, sorry, go.
I mean, other people would use the word mystic, but it's not very common. It's not really a common philosophy. It's more like literary usually.
So when Borges speaks about mysticism, what is he talking about then?
Probably the same sort of thing. I'm just saying that it's not really used in philosophy that much as like a term people, oh, that's a mystic. Usually it's more of a, what's the term? Not derogatory, but a term that's not very positive.
Okay. And he said that Plato has quite a determinist or an implicit determinist element in him. Do you know what he's referring to?
I don't know if I'd agree, but I don't really know.
Okay. This is what I discussed with you earlier because he speaks about, okay, so this is about the role of the senses, which we don't need to read, but this is what I mentioned earlier. Like I said that the trouble seems to begin as soon as you introspect and then form theories on the basis of introspection. Because he gives an example of Freud's division of ego, id, and superego, which is this, what do you call it when there's three divisions? And Plato has three divisions as well, right? There's the
tripartite.
Tripartite. He's got like the soul and the
or triad.
Yeah, he's something like that. He's got like there's the appetites, the spirited element, and then the reason. And so Freud has that as well. And you could say Freud's version is nonsense and so is Plato's, but then they would have got this from like part introspecting, and that's probably where they went wrong. If you wanted to say that they didn't intentionally come up with this, which I don't think, who knows, but
I'm not sure about Freud. I think, well, he's just more complicated than that. Maybe a little bit. I'm not sure if it's really related.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it like it is interesting that they both have these three divisions of man, and then isn't there something like the tribe? What's in the Christianity? There's like three gods or something. I have no idea what that is, but
three seems often very common, like the three primary values in objectivism. I
Right.
mean, it's just a common way to distinguish things, I think. That's
Okay.
why it's three often, I think. Not for
Okay.
any special, like trying to map it to something.
Yeah.
And I
Okay.
think it just happens to be that you can often distinguish things in the three different ways. I don't know why, but it seems to be the case.
Rand's formulation of the law of identity is
Yeah.
existence is identity. What I don't get what the significance of that is to me. That seems kind of
To exist is to have
saying
an
that.
identity. To exist is to have a nature.
And why is that? Why is that special? Why is that special formulation of the law of identity? What's so? Who cares? Like, can't you just use
I
Aristotle's?
mean,
Why is that so revolutionary? Apparently, it is. So
it's just the way it's phrased. I'm not sure if it really is that big a deal
yeah. Okay.
to me. But yeah, it's an interesting way to phrase it. And it can also essentialize Aristotle. But I think it's implicit in Aristotle. Just you can take two different statements, and he definitely says everything has an identity and that there's existence. I mean, yeah, I didn't put in one sentence, but he put in two. It's like he knew both. It's not like it was a discovery that existence applies an identity.
Do we know anything about what world stuff Parmenides found? Like for him, nothing changed, but what was the world stuff?
Who knows?
We don't know. Okay. For him, nothing, everything is just one thing, but he didn't say what it was, right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I would guess like he didn't apply it was one thing. There's one single thing that everything is.
But we can't categorize him as like a monist or anything like that because we have no idea. Oh, wait, he's a monist,
Well,
but we can't
yeah,
categorize him as a,
monist. Materialist, I don't know.
yeah, we don't know if he's a materialist. Okay.
I don't anyway, but definitely a monist.
Hey, by the way, it's amazing how many times themes related to these early philosophers come up when I'm reading We by
Yes.
Zemaitzin or whatever his name is.
Mhm.
There's so much about the flux in there and feeling unstable and uncertain and everything shifting and changing, and then the safe world of numbers that keeps coming
Yes.
up over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's
It's a
cool
good
because
book.
I can see how this, if you have a basic fundamental, basic essentialized understanding of this, all these, the main lines of argument and philosophy, it just goes to everything. Like it comes up all the time.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so he said in one of the lectures, the association between the universal and perfect was very strong. I assume he mean in Greek culture at the time, like because of Socrates, because he said Plato cashes in on it to conclude that the world of perfection is precisely the world of universals.
Yeah, there's something about culture, probably. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what it sounds like would mean. It sounds cultural.
Oh, okay, so now these are the Plato's arguments for why the world of universals exists as a separate realm apart from the world of appearances. And he explains his method. So this is the first argument, which is his argument from the differences between universals and particulars. So I just put these names in here randomly. So he tries to give an analogy to the method. He says, well, how do you know Max and Ben are two different people? You make a list of all the different characteristics and you say they have to be completely different entities because they have completely opposite characteristics. But with this example, I made this wrong because it can't just be two different people, right? Like the analogy to his argument is more like, how do you know that Louis and a what else? Louis and a crocodile are two different things. That's probably a better analogy because you're like, oh well, Louis doesn't have 50 teeth, 100 teeth or whatever, and
Yeah.
he doesn't eat hippos, and so therefore, like they're completely different. You can't say he's the same. And then you do that. That's probably a better analogy than two different people, right?
Yeah, I think it's a better analogy.
Yeah, okay.
Like, are they really different, or do they only seem different?
Okay, so he does that with universals and particulars.
Yeah,
And then he
they're like,
concludes that there
because
must.
like in a way, oh, you can think of, I don't know, the nature of the good, you can think of it, but you can't see it with your eyes in the way that you can see an apple. So it's like, in a way, it's like, oh, well, they're obviously different. They have to be two
Right.
different things because they're
I get
distinct.
it. I actually think in the lecture he said if you take two different opposite kinds of people, like a thief and a good man or something like that. But even with that analogy, you can go, well, they're still people. So, and it kind of screws up the argument, I think. Versus if I say
Yeah.
Louis and a crocodile, I'm like, okay, they're two completely different creatures. And so based on that basis, you could also say, well, look, they have different features and so do universals and particulars. And because we can't see universals, they're not the same thing as particulars. They exist in a different realm. So it's more, if I wanted an analogy, it's not so much two opposite people, just two completely different things, like a human and a chair, for example.
Yeah. Or maybe even more directly to the particular versus universal. When you close your eyes, you can imagine the color white, but that's different than when you open your eyes and you, I don't know, just look at a tree. I mean, there's one that you can see without sight and one you can
Right.
see with sight. So somebody might reason that, oh, how do I not know that actually these are just separate types of things, that they have independent existence?
Yeah.
That's the world in front of me versus the world when I close my eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I like that. Yes. And I can see how that's actually it's quite difficult if that's the answer you're given. It seems quite reasonable to me. Like it's difficult to notice that, oh, well, white is something I abstracted away from entities and I'm able to like that's hard.
Right.
It's very hard to do that. You can have someone tell you that and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. But to actually do it yourself is, yeah, I don't know. I,
Yeah.
I would have got caught up in these. I think this is a good argument.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's why Aristotle's replies to these things are so
Right.
useful, because then it
Right.
starts to make sense. Like, oh, I see Plato is just almost making a stupid argument. Like, now that I see what's wrong with the argument, it's easy to answer now. But before then, if
Right.
you never heard the question before, you didn't know the answer, then you'd be really stuck, I think.
I
How would
think
you
so
respond to
too.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is it's like if you really try and get into this mindset without, I don't know that much about Aristotle. I do have
Yeah.
knowledge of concepts and, them formed on the basis of senses. But even if I just put that aside and try get into this mindset and just based on my own observation, think about it, this is difficult. Like I don't know if you'd be, like you said, I agree. I don't think I'd be able to come up with an answer to this.
Yeah. It'd be very difficult.
All right, argument from the order of knowledge. He says, what in logic do you have to learn first, universals or particulars? Plato says it's impossible to know particulars, to classify them, to categorize them, unless you knew the universals in
Yeah.
advance. Okay, seems reasonable. And then to define a universal, we have to assemble the instances and grasp what's common. But if we knew in advance what's common, we would never have to inquire. And if we didn't know in advance what's common, then we would have no idea how to inquire.
Yes, then the Meno. If that's the dialogue, the Meno or Meno, however you pronounce it. But yeah, I know that one.
Well, isn't this okay? I had two questions about this. So this argument, I had more trouble getting into the headspace or the context of seeing it as reasonable. So, and I am trying to carefully not superimpose what I already know onto it. But the first problem is, okay, so for him, you either don't have to inquire because you knew it in advance, or you do have to inquire. But you do have to inquire, but you don't know how to inquire. But he goes with this is getting confusing. I hope hopefully it will make sense. But for him, he says, okay, we that means we already know in advance, because otherwise we wouldn't know how to inquire. But then if that's true, that you don't have to inquire, then how is it that, we don't know things? Like we almost, it's like, it's contradictory, because even on his side, I feel like it's still a problem for him, because he's still got the problem to deal with of, you need to inquire. Like, you don't need to inquire according to him, but you also do need to inquire if you know everything in advance. It doesn't make sense. Like, either side you pick of this dichotomy, to me, doesn't make sense, even what he's picked. So isn't that a
It's a
problem for him? Like,
paradox. Yes, I think
okay.
it was. I think it remained a problem. I don't think he ever did
Okay.
answer it,
Yeah, okay.
actually.
Oh,
Like
right.
he tried
Okay.
to imply, like, oh, well, you do know intuitively. You just recollect and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I don't think he really addressed it, though. He never solved the problem. I don't think.
Okay.
We're kind of like
And
just put it aside. Like he never even tried, I think. Just like, oh, here's a question, whatever. I don't care. I'm not even try. I think that's kind of what happened.
why I also don't get why it's so difficult to him to think that we don't know in advance, but we just observe things and then categorize them together. Like, you see this thing moving and it's got fur and it's friendly, and you go, after like 10 of them, you're like, oh, dog, or whatever. And I this one, I had much more trouble getting my head around why you'd fall into this. Like, I don't get, why is it so difficult to see that? Like, cup, you see 10 cups and you're like, oh, this is a cup. Like, that's what I had trouble with. I don't get why this is even a sensical argument.
I'm not sure if he would even call cup a universal, though, actually. Like, I think universal should be, I'm not entirely sure. But I mean, to use something more in line with Plato, let's say good is the universal here, which is probably easier to think about, or where he's coming from anyway. I mean, you're saying a cup might be a way to argue against him, but where Plato's coming from, think about how would you define good? And it's saying either you already know what's good, so then you don't even need to see how do I figure this out, because you already have the universal.
Yeah.
Or if you didn't know in advance that it was universal, you would not be able to find that it is in fact universal. So I
Right.
think Plato does take the position that, well, we do know in advance. We just don't remember. That's why we don't seem to know, because we haven't recollected yet. Not that we don't have it, but we haven't received the right stimulus to be reminded yet. So I think Plato does take the answer to this, the assumption anyway, that, well, we have it anyway. We never needed to know because we already knew.
Yeah, I know he's on that side. I had tried. Yeah, so I mean, you're saying he's really not thinking about like lower level concepts like cups or dogs or anything. He's thinking about the good,
Not,
and that's what. Okay. Because when you do think about cups or dogs or people, you're like, this argument doesn't make sense. Like, you don't
yeah, you
need to,
start to break it
it just
down.
seems so obvious that you just inquire. But I can't tell how much of this is me superimposing what I have learned.
Well, I'm answering it that way because I actually read it ourselves answer to this a few times. He responds to it in a few different ways. And each way usually involves something like Plato never really bothered to answer, and that's actually a matter of just making better distinctions. That you have to actually suppose that there are other modes of knowing or coming to understand things other than strictly thinking.
What do you mean?
That you have other capacities other than just abstraction or something like that. Like Aristotle says more about sensation or perception,
Okay.
knowing
Yeah.
different forms of knowing, even
Okay.
intuition and other things. So he's kind of Aristotle answers by saying, well, there's things besides just knowledge that can come to understand things. That we
Okay.
get the material to understand from more than simply the universal or just the
Right.
particular. That there's more than one capacity to
Right.
understand those things.
Okay.
Like the object of knowledge is different than the object of sight.
Yeah. Okay, we'll skip the rest of that one. It's the same. Yeah, I'm back with this. I don't get why he says knowledge must be possible, as in why that's a starting. It's like an axiom for him.
I don't know why.
Isn't he just assuming what the sophists claim to disprove? Like, if you just say knowledge is possible, aren't you just, you're not even arguing against the sophists, you're just assuming the opposite.
It almost seems that way, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
In a way that's like, it's got to be possible because we have universals, therefore it must be true. We just got to find a
Okay.
way. Just look harder. I think kind of that's the vibe I get from Plato, which I know is a very philosophical say, a vibe, but that's always what I understood it to be.
Yeah. Do you remember his reality tests? He gives tests to identify what's okay. So
Actually, I didn't.
he devises these reality tests, which we'll go over.
Yeah.
To tell what is real and what isn't real. He says that you can't really know the particulars because he agrees with the Heraclitean and the sophists. True knowledge is of the forms. I keep seeing like violations of Parmenides' basic principle. Like, doesn't that concern it? I understood that all of them are applying basically to Parmenides and Heraclitus. And so isn't it a concern for them when they just completely reject it outright? Like, if you say you can't really know, you can know, but you can't know at the same time, isn't that just violating what Parmenides said in the first place?
Well, I'm not sure about Plato because if the real things are abstractions, universals, then you might be able to argue then that all universals actually unite to one thing, which is God, maybe, or whatever it might be. I mean, that's how I would think you could. You're not outright rejecting Parmenides, just like you're not accepting him, but you're modifying him.
I think we covered this. What's really real? It's what's more important. What's like, so the material world is just a byproduct of this other world. So it's real, but it's not real. It's a byproduct. So it's not as important is another way to
Almost
put it.
like it's more real. Forms are more real, which is a weird way to phrase it, but that's the best way I could think of it. Like, oh yes, this real world is real, but it's really real when it's the forms like it's like the forms to you is like a transcendental reality. It's even better than reality.
Yeah, so he gives 4 tests, which is what are the tests of reality, basically. So he says, which do you think he regards as really real? And then the way he determines that is using these tests that he's devised. The first thing I wanted to know is how the hell, like, where does he even come up with this? I will go over them, just the titles. So the first test is to be real, a thing has to exist. Second test, a thing is real when it's knowable. The real is perfect, the ideal. The real is the original, as against imitations. And I was like, yeah, where the hell does all this come from? Like, where he just pulls this out of nowhere and he's like, oh, here are the tests of reality. Therefore, the universals are real. Okay.
I mean, it's probably implicit. Like, I'm not sure how he derives these things, but usually it's through the dialogues that he demonstrates these things. I mean, 1 and 2 seem good, like valid things that are good, like real tests that seem sensible.
But isn't 1 just a tautology? It's like, to be real, a thing has to be real. If it's not real, it's not real. Like,
notice it just says exist. I mean, to be real, I mean, so you might say it's just real because I said so, but yeah, it's kind of obvious. But to say it's real is to imply, is to say it exists.
Okay.
I guess it's obvious, but there's nothing wrong with testing the obvious. I mean, just in the same way that somebody might say, oh, unicorns are real. But you say, why? But, oh, because you thought of it. But then you say, oh, but they don't exist. So they're not real. So something like that. I could see that coming up.
Yeah. That makes sense. Also, when you have this world, the material world, that according to Plato is contradictory because it's also it's the world of the Heraclitean flux. Isn't that still contradiction still exists with that explanation? Even in the non-material world, you have a thing that is and isn't at the same time, and that's you still it's still the like you're still in yeah okay there's some other dimension where it's friendlier to Parmenides' principle, but you still have this one that's not, and so why is that not considered an issue?
I'm not really good at answering the questions about like the way Plato relates to the other philosophers. I don't know how he addresses them at all. Like,
Yeah,
I'd
okay.
only be guessing, but I don't know how he deals with it or addresses it. But I can definitely address the things Plato says on his own terms. I don't know how he
my
addressed others, but
my motivation in asking these questions is trying to find out what line of reasoning did he take to even get to these. It's one thing to just remember what someone says, but
yeah,
it's another like I'm trying to get his line of reasoning here. Like, how did he put this whole thing over? Is the if you keep asking questions and you get to a point where someone just says, well, it just is what it is, or someone just says that's just what they don't give you, you can't get to any root, then like I feel like how can you believe that, how can you know their philosophy is valid? You can't.
yeah.
Beyond getting to the
I'm trying to.
self-evident, obviously, like you're
Yeah.
supposed to be able to get to the root of everything, right?
Well, let's approach the question in a different way since how do I want to approach that? So how would Plato answer that given these things? Given what Heraclitus said? I mean, if everything is moving, how could Plato respond? And what's your initial thought even then? How could he respond to that?
Yeah.
Do you have an initial thought yourself?
He might say, well, it's all an illusion. It's I don't know, it's so bizarre. Like, how does he go from there's some other dimension and that's the real one, and then suddenly there's this world, but it's contradictory, but that's okay, it's not contradicting Parmenides' principle? I have no idea, actually. I don't know. It seems like such a messy,
Yeah.
you've like split the world in two, and now you have to come up with some reason for why you're not violating Parmenides' principle. I don't know. I don't have an answer, to be honest.
I think going off of that, so we see what so Parmenides is saying that everything's a one thing. It all unifies into one thing. And Plato is saying that ultimately that's not the particular world is not really real. I'm not sure if he says illusory. I mean, it's there, it's just not primary. The primary thing is the universal, and the particulars come from that, or they project out from that and become real to the extent that the universals make them real. Everything reduces to universal ultimately and primarily. And in that sense, we could say, I mean, you can respond to Parmenides by saying, well, look, I've addressed that all these things that are moving apparently exist as distinct. I mean, Plato's not denying that, but then he's addressing Heraclitus or Parmenides by saying, but that's just the impression that they're separate is the illusory part. The things there that might be real, but the distinctions you make might be illusory. So in reality, it's just the truth is that everything does unify. I think that's how we would get to it.
Okay, so that was one of Parmenides' deductions, that everything is one, but then he also, his basic principle from which he deduced that was that what is and what isn't, and doesn't exist and can't be thought about. And here you have Plato saying, well, in this material world, the thing is and isn't, like it shifts and changes, and it's not. He agrees with Heraclitus, but then you're still in a sense like if you're saying that this material world is real, you're still violating Parmenides' principle, right? Like you're still saying something isn't. You're saying like, okay, yeah, there's no like things aren't consistent in this world. They're like they're fluctuating around, they're shifting, changing, whatever, like Heraclitus says. And then for Heraclitus, the consequence of that is that there is no it. And so for Plato, he's like, yeah, sure, in this material world, there's no it, but the it is in the other world. But you're still, like, okay, you've got a different world that's compatible with Parmenides, but you still have the problem of this world, which is Heraclitean and not compatible with Parmenides. So you're still stuck in
Well,
to me, this is just how
it's a
I'm reading it. You're
yeah.
still stuck in the violating Parmenides' basic principle.
I think Plato would just respond by saying, well, the real world is a projection. It's a projected image. It's not what's really there. It's like a hologram. The universals project down to what we see. It makes a projection of what we think are this contradictions, which are only apparently real, which they're real in a way that they are projections, in the way that a hologram is still real in the literal sense. It doesn't mean that the thing you see and say that a movie theater is real, that there really are aliens as much as there's a projection from the theater projector that makes it seem that way.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. Going with that analogy, could you have a theater where you project nothing onto the screen? It's just there's an actual nothing on the screen.
To project a nothing, I don't think that would be possible.
But that's what that's what I feel like he's saying. He's saying that he's saying something is being projected, but it can be nothing. It can be, you can have something that isn't because it's a world of Heraclitean flux. There's contradictions everywhere. So you're projecting contradictions, and on the screen, there's contradictions and nothing. And so you're still, that's why I'm like, okay, well, I get that it's a projection, but you're still, to me, you're still violating.
What do you mean nothing? By not projecting nothing, do you mean the lack of doing any projecting?
No, no.
The actual,
well, I mean exactly that. I mean something is being projected, but there's some bits of nothing. Yeah, there's like nothings on the screen. Yeah. Because that's the Heraclitean world, right? And that's what is the world of images. And so it's like you're projecting something, but it's actually a nothing as well on the screen. Once you get to the screen, it's a nothing. So that's why I'm like, I don't really get what, it's, I understand that maybe, okay, if his idea is wrong, that's fine. It's going to have contradictions. I'm trying to get at like, how did they not, or why was this not a discussion or something that was given, what I'm saying? Like, where was the rationalization? I'm trying to find out, how do you rationalize?
I almost feel like this must have been in a dialogue. Like this must have been something Plato addressed. It almost sounds like something in one of his dialogues. I haven't read them, that's the problem, but
right.
I'm sure he addressed it. I'm just trying to think creatively here. And I'm just almost thinking like a writer here. If I take something so insane, how do I make it work? In a way, you have projecting things, and you could project from the universal and what's you project in nothing. In a way, that's Plato saying that any universe, any concept can be projected as long as it can be thought of, then it's real, then it can be projected. And that's sufficient to be projected. That even the nothing itself is not really nothing, which gets weird, of course. But I think you would try to get out of it by saying that the nothing is too also universal. That whatever we think of as nothing isn't really what nothing is. And then it gets all convoluted, of course, but I don't know if you can break out of that box without some wild arguments that start to get progressively more absurd.
Okay, cool. But yeah, that it's interesting to get into that and see if you can pick out what happens when you get yourself into this kind of problem, and like how creative you have to be to get out. So
sometimes I approach questions like that. What can I possibly say that would resolve a contradiction, no matter how insane it sounds?
Yeah.
And just try to see how insane it gets the deeper I go.
Right.
Like it started easier to say, oh, universal, you just close your eyes, you see one or the other. Oh, that's easy. But then you can start asking, well, how do I not violate Parmenides? Well, you project the universals. Well, can you project nothing? Well, I guess so. I guess nothing is universal. Well, is nothing really nothing? How can you call it nothing if it's not nothing? Then it just starts to get insane at that point.
Right. Let's see, test 2.
That was not bad, but because I mean, if a thing is knowable, I mean, it has a nature.
Yeah.
It's a determinate nature. If it's knowable, you could know it. So at least that's compatible with a realist point of view.
Although he might not mean that you knowable means, he might not mean, well, you could grasp, maybe for him that means mystic insight, like when you do the years of mathematical training.
Yeah. So it might include that. So yeah, which wouldn't be compatible, but this statement could be compatible depending on his other views, depending on his epistemology.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I could go with that. And then you could even say, okay, it's not an issue for the Christian God, because for him, knowable could mean through mystic insight. So
yeah. Or something isn't that it could be known by something. So if God can know it, that's all that matters. Doesn't matter if a human can know it.
Okay.
That's how a
Okay.
Christian would answer that.
Right.
And I know that because a Christian friend of mine actually answered that to me once.
Right. Yeah, I think if you want to advocate some philosophy, then I assume that if the philosophy is wrong and you want to advertise it convincingly, then you've got to come up with very somehow like convincing rationalizations, right, for everything. Because if your rationalizations just sound stupid, then no one's going to believe you.
Yeah. So like the first two tests are a good way to make it sound like you're, well, at least the argument is sound or valid, I should say.
Yeah.
That thing is real, it is knowable. Well, at least if you make a claim that something's real, regardless of what your philosophy is, you should be able to at least cover that answer, no matter how wrong it is. You should at least be able to answer it. If you can answer that, then at least you can argue that it's real, even if you're wrong, of course.
I'm just trying to get my head around what I was asking in test 3. Yeah, with test 3, isn't it a bit circular? Like he's saying, okay, the real world is the world of forms. Therefore, the world of forms is the real world. Like, because to say that the real is the perfect is the ideal. It just seemed kind of circular. The real is the perfect. Like, where did that come from?
Where did it come from? Let's see. Well, how would I figure that out? Real is
I
the
know it has
perfect.
something to do with Socrates, because Socrates, implicitly developed this idea of universals as being important, the knowledge of universals being important. And apparently it was already, as one of my questions was before, like was already associated with the perfect.
Yeah, like in a way, how could it exist if it unless it's perfect? Like why would
But
imperfect things exist?
exactly. But then that goes back to this one, right? To be a real, if to be real, it has to be perfect. Then what does that mean does that mean that everything in the material world is non-real? So violating Parmenides' principle?
That's a hard one. This is
Yeah.
hard. That's a hard
Well,
one.
You may not
Yeah,
know. I'm just curious
I'm
if like
thinking.
Plato had, I know it's okay if you don't know them because you haven't read the dialogues, but I was just curious as like, what was, I don't know, maybe at the maybe I'm superimposing my own context of knowledge, so it's screwing it up, but I'm just trying to get around what was convincing about him because it
Realism.
seems like if you start asking questions, it seems off.
Something's perfect. It's, well, perfect. It does sound circular. If the realists are perfect, that thing has to exist. I'm not sure this, could Plato just not notice? I don't know. I don't think it's true that he just
Okay.
didn't notice the implication of number one on number three.
Test for the real is the original as against imitations. Okay, that's I don't know if that's like taking one thing from a different context and putting it in here, but it
The
also
most
seems
real.
circular because he's saying the world of forms is original, the real is original. I don't know. It just seems I'm not quite like some of his arguments. I'm like, yeah, okay, I can see how that's convincing. Like the first one, the different on the argument from the differences between particulars and universals. Like I'd be stuck on that. But these are like, it's not that I would solve them, but I'd be like, this doesn't make sense.
Um, I would almost think of it as maybe he means more that the most real, or the, I'm not sure. What would be